All right, I want to talk about two kinds of reasoning, two kinds of certainty in reasoning, and one kind of certainty is going to be familiar, but I'm trying to stay a little bit minimal with my commitments, and that's going to be the tricky part. Here's the plan for today. I first want to talk a little bit about my motivations for doing all of that, and then I'm going to give you a picture of reasoning and coherence. I hope I can stay non-committal on a lot of stuff, but there will be some substantive commitments in that. That's on qualitative, so qualitative belief kind framework. Then I'm trying to generalize that to something that I call Ascent Levels. Here, Ascent Levels. And Ascent Levels are kind of my term for credences, but because they're not really credences, I call them Ascent Levels in order to distinguish them. And then there's something I call Radicality. That's the only novel thing for Magdalena. That's what used to be called firmness, but people convinced me that I shouldn't call it that, so I call it Radicality now. And I say that Radicality and Ascent Levels are confused, so they run together in certain parts in literature, and you might think that's implausible once you see what they are. And then I want to end by saying, no, they really are. Sometimes they run together in the literature, and that's why it's important. But of course, I think it's important anyway. Okay, let's start with the motivation. So Broom says, I have some idea of how to reason with all our beliefs, but I'm less clear how we could reason with degrees of belief. And then this motivated Julia and Sinan to talk about reasoning with credences, or not that, but that kind of thing, broadly speaking. And there are certain problems that people have thought might arise for reasoning with credences. Harman says it's too complicated. Frankish says, well, maybe it works for system 1, but system 2 reasoning can't work with credences. And then there is a kind of naive reaction, thinking that Bayesianism already gives you a theory of how to reason with credences. I think that Julia and Sinan have done good jobs in saying that that's just not right. I'm just on board with that, basically. So if you need reasons, the Bayesian tell you what to do with new evidence, but there's reasoning that doesn't take into account new evidence, or what you do once you got the evidence. Then the Bayesians assume that credences are closed under something like validity or probabilistic validity, something like that. And once you assume that, certain things don't arise, right? Because credences are already closed in this way. And then a point that Sinan makes that I like a lot is that Bayesians usually don't have a lot to say about doxastic justification, and because reasoning has a lot to do with doxastic justification, it seems like there's more work to be done there. So I'm on board with all of that. Okay, so here's my thesis that I want to defend. There are at least two different kinds of graded certainty, uncertainty that are important in reasoning, and I call them radicality and ascent level. And I want to distinguish these two, and that's basically that's all I want to say. Now, in order to distinguish the two, I want to characterize these two things, what they're doing in reasoning. And I think they're doing importantly different things in reasoning, and that's why we have to keep them separate. Okay, there are some intuitions. So here are the basic intuitions that captured. And of course, if you're on one side or the other side, you might think that one of these intuitions is just not an intuition at all. So what I call the radicality intuition says, if by good deductive reasoning, I will only talk about deductive reasoning, but my notion of deductive reasoning will be pretty broad, not just logical. If by good deductive reasoning you believe B on the basis of A, then you must be more certain of A than you are of B, especially if you have doubts whether B follows from A. And the ascent level intuition says, if by good deductive reasoning you believe B on the basis of A, then you must be at least as certain of B as you are of A, unless you have doubts whether B follows from A. These are obviously inconsistent if there is good deductive reasoning that results in Bayesian relations. So it seems like you can't have both, but I think there is some initial appeal to both of these things. I want to say there are true versions of both of these things, but something has to give, right? And I think what has to give is that what we mean by certain here, there's an ambiguity. There are two kinds of certainty, and one kind of certainty is underwriting radicality, is underwriting the radicality intuition, and ascent levels are underwriting the ascent intuitions. That's going to be a picture. I hope you find these at least somewhat intuitively gripping. I will try to make them a little bit, to support them a little bit more. Wrong direction. Okay, here's the picture of reasoning that I will be working with. So I think there are entailments. So my notion of entailment is very broad, and I don't really care that much what your notion of entailment is. So Declan, you should plug in epistemic entailment. Other people's, if you agree with Declan on that stuff, you should also plug in epistemic entailments. I'm going to say, well, logical consequence, and then probably lexical entailments, and maybe some other stuff. Something roughly in that area. That's what I mean by entailment. Okay. And then deductive reasoning is adjusting and forming doxastic attitudes in light of those entailments. That's what I mean by deductive reasoning, the kind of reasoning that interests me here. And then of course there's a question, what is this in light of? But I want to stay neutral with respect to the taking condition and these kinds of things. So something in the light of, maybe it's aiming at certain things, maybe it's having a taking, maybe whatever it is that does the job. That's what the in light of thing is supposed to capture. And then here's claim number 1. If gamma entails A, then it's incoherent to accept everything in gamma and to deny A. So entailment gives you or encodes information about what's coherent and incoherent, in a certain sense of coherence and incoherence. That is a little bit tricky to spell out. Some logicians that I like do that. They are called bilateralists, so they explain what consequences in those terms. So you can also go the other way. I think that's a valuable project. I will take that as a primitive, and I'm happy to also take these two speech acts or these two mental attitudes or something like that as a, so in the coarse-grained qualitative sense, we have kind of two attitudes to begin with. All right. So then I will assume, and of course that's a big assumption, especially in this kind of context, that there is something like a wide scope coherence requirement on our attitudes. So you're irrational if you're incoherent. And that means then from these two claims we have the conclusion that if you accept all the premises of an entailment and you deny the conclusion, then you are incoherent. And furthermore, I will assume that being incoherent in that sense is somehow bad. Now, this badness is also difficult to spell out, and maybe it can be overridden in certain ways, and maybe you're not always ought to be coherent in this sense, but by and large, there's something bad about being incoherent. And luckily, we have a way of getting ourselves into states in which we're less incoherent or more coherent, and reasoning is one of these things, and I think that's something that Broom is right about. And Broom says, we know that people have a particular means of coming to satisfy some of the requirements of rationality, and that is reasoning. Reasoning is something we do. It is a mental activity of ours that can bring us to satisfy some of the requirements of rationality. And because I think there is this coherence requirement, that makes a whole lot of sense, right? You have a coherence requirement, and then reasoning can bring you into conformity with that coherence requirement. Another way of saying that then is that reasoning is an act in which we enforce coherent patterns of attitudes, right? So what the entailment gives you, if you have an entailment from gamma to A, you know that only certain patterns of acceptance and rejection or acceptance and denial are coherent. If you accept all of what's in gamma, then you can't deny A, and if you accept A, then you can't, if you deny A, then you can't accept all of the stuff in gamma. So there are certain patterns, and good reasoning enforces one of those patterns. And it enforces those patterns in virtue of your sensitivity or your performing this act in light of this entailment. Okay, so that was the picture for two sorted attitudes, right? Only two attitudes, acceptance and denial. And now let's get more attitudes. Try to move to something that looks more like a more like credences. So I will assume that there are these things that I call ascent levels, and as I keep on saying, they're roughly like credences, and I think in the paradigmatic case, giving each other arguments and reasoning is driving up ascent levels, right? If you give someone an argument for A, you aim at, or you, in whatever way of aiming at, making that person increase their assent to your conclusion. And if you're reasoning, that in some sense aims at bumping up your assent to the conclusion. And that's what I want to capture with this assent level. So you assent more to something. What is this assent level? Well, you can have very different views on that. How to cash that out, and this basically correspond to different views about how you cash out credences. You can think, well, maybe it goes together with a tendency to assert A. If you have a high assent level in A, maybe it goes together with dispositions to have the possibility of A figure in your practical decision making or practical deliberation in certain ways. Maybe you have a tendency to disagree with people who say not A. If you have these kinds of things, that's, I think, is an indication that you assent to A to a high degree, or somewhat highish degree. Now, I will just talk about assent level, and they are totally ordered. I will think that assent levels gives you a total order over the attitudes that you have, or the propositions. If you want to include suspension, that's going to be a little bit tricky, I think. But I think you can do it. You just have to move from a total order to a partial order of the assent levels, and then kind of put suspension to one side as incomparable in certain ways. I'm not going to talk about that. So let's just take suspension off the table. So they are similar to credences in some respects, but I want to keep an open mind. They're different from credences. Assent levels are different from credences. In particular, I'm not assuming probabilism. I don't think that these assent levels are governed by the probability axioms, and I do not think that they have to take real values. So I'm really just assuming that they are totally ordered. So in that sense, it's maybe a little bit more like ranks. And most importantly, I stay neutral with respect to that stuff. So if gamma entails A and gamma entails B, does gamma entail A and B? If you are committed to the usual quantitative framework, you will deny that. If you're committed to a qualitative framework, you will typically assert that. Some people call that the watershed. Principles like that, the watershed between quantitative and qualitative frameworks. And of course, that's the kind of stuff that's going to give you trouble for lottery paradox stuff and things like that, right? That's what's really doing the work. So, but I'm saying, whatever, just stay neutral on that. And that basically corresponds to staying neutral on finite additivity, right? I'm not taking on finite additivity, and that gives me neutrality for that thing. Okay. How can we then transfer everything I said for the qualitative case to this case for assent levels? When we think about reasoning, well, one thing we can say is if A entails B, then it's incoherent to assent less to B than to A, unless you have doubts about the entailment. I have always this qualifier in there because I think, for reasons that are similar to what Sinan said in conversation with Julia about you have to leave room for error in a certain way. So there's these little qualifiers that are supposed to take care of that. That corresponds to this incoherent stuff for entailment in the assertion denial case. So why is that plausible? If you're a Bayesian, then you will already be sold on this, right? You will basically accept, do you think that goes without saying? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. If you want to give arguments for that, one thing that you can think is, well, look there, if A entails B, then there is no possibility, no possible world in which A is true and B fails. So every possibility that speaks against assenting to A also speaks against assenting to B, also speaks against assenting to A, and if those are epistemic possibilities, then really you shouldn't be more certain of the premise as you are of the conclusion in that sense. The other thing you can say in defense of these kinds of things is that good reasoning should drive up your assent, but it's not clear how good reasoning can drive up your assent unless you have to assent at least as much to the conclusion as you assent to the premise. Because if it's okay to just, I give you a good argument, you assent a lot to the premises, and then I ask you, so what do you think about the conclusion? You say, no, of course I reject that. And I'm thinking, yeah, but the point of giving you an argument was that you then accept the conclusion. If you don't do that, what's the point of having arguments in the first place? So it seems like a principle like that is really closely connected to the very point of reasoning. I don't think you can make much sense of what we're doing when we're reasoning with each other unless you have something like that. I call that dominance. Don't confuse that with dominance in the sense of dominance arguments, right? It has nothing to do with that. The name dominance here comes from belief revision literature, where this kind of thing is sometimes called dominance, but has nothing to do with dominance arguments in Bayesian frameworks. All right. So I kind of work backwards to features of these ascent levels in a certain way from facts about entailment. So I think the one thing I want to keep fixed is this dominance thing. I think you can really not do without something in the ballpark of dominance, and then entailment facts. And once we have those, we can determine certain things about what are coherent and incoherent patterns of ascent levels. So the first thing to notice is that if, let's call a theorem something that is entailed by everything. Right? Something that's entailed by everything is a theorem, and then we immediately know that theorems get maximal ascent level just by dominance, right? Because dominance tells you that if A entails B, then it's incoherent to assent less to B than to A. So if something follows from everything, it has to have maximal ascent level. Also, if negations of theorems entail everything, which is a little bit like an ex falso principle, then you also immediately know that negations of theorems have minimal ascent level. Right? So you now have bounds on the ascent levels, an upper bound, a lower bound. Everything else has to take place in between. And if you want, you can of course assign 0 and 1, and then you're in the unit interval, and then you're moving closer and closer to credences if you do that. If you assume that disjunctions are entailed by their disjuncts, you know that you must assent at least as much to a disjunction as you assent to each disjunct. And of course you can multiply this now. The more facts you assume about how logical vocabulary works in entailments, the more facts about what is coherent and incoherent patterns of ascent levels you get. I only talked about individual premises, so single premise arguments so far. There's a question how this generalizes to multi-premise arguments. I will assume that we have ascent levels in conjunctions, and I will assume that the ascent level in a conjunction is the ascent level. So I will define the ascent level to a set of propositions as the ascent level that you have to the conjunction. Of course, this requires a little bit of idealization because you might not have an ascent level, an actual ascent level to the conjunction, but if we idealize a bit the ascent level you should have towards the conjunction, and then we can do everything in terms of single premise arguments. That actually builds in something about conjunction, right? It gives you, so logicians would talk about a multiplicative conjunction, right? Linear logic distinguishes between a multiplicative conjunction and an additive conjunction. It's basically using a multiplicative conjunction, especially a multiplicative conjunction on the left of the turnstile. That's what's assumed here in logic terms. All right. Just as in the binary case, I'm again going to say that good deductive reasoning enforces coherent patterns of attitudes. Now our attitudes are no longer assertion and denial, or acceptance and rejection. Our attitudes are ascent levels, but other than that, everything is going to go just as it went before. So good deductive reasoning enforces coherent patterns of ascent level by adjusting and forming ascent levels. in light of entailments, and thereby we establish also basing relations. That's what I'm assuming, at least. Now notice, reasoning, I said that paradigmatic reasoning drives up ascent levels, and I was very adamant about that because I thought that is somehow the point of reasoning. But I think once we have the picture on the table, we can realize that there could also be reasoning that drives down ascent levels. And here's a case. You assent strongly to A, your partner is home. You also assent, that's coming into the situation. You also assent strongly to B, if your partner is home, then the door is unlocked. Then you come home and you notice that the door is locked. What are you going to do? So you, by checking the door, you come to assent very little to the claim C. The door is unlocked. And then by modus tollens, you come to decrease your ascent level to A. So you come to decrease your ascent level to the proposition that your partner is home. Basically, you come home, you find out the door is locked, and then you thereby find out that your partner isn't home. Pretty straightforward case. Of course, you could have reinstated coherent ascent levels, not by decreasing your ascent towards A, but by increasing your ascent towards C. That would be just as coherent, but I take it everyone notices that that's silly. You should go by modus tollens, not by modus ponens in this reasoning bit. And then question is why? Why go for modus tollens here and not for modus ponens? There are two equally coherent patterns of ascent levels, so the reasoning could go in either direction, in principle, for all I've said so far, right? But it's obviously silly to do one and not silly to do the other thing. And I think that's where radicality comes in. Basically, radicality is the kind of thing that decides whether you should use a modus ponens or a modus tollens in this kind of case. So I think that radicality, the thing that decides whether you should go for modus ponens or modus tollens, is not the same thing as ascent levels. It's a different kind of thing. And that's why we need something else, right? We need to decide for each case whether we should go modus ponens or modus tollens. Ascent levels are not going to do the job. We need something else. And that's radicality. So degrees of radicality explain which coherent pattern of ascent levels an inference enforces in light of an entailment. So you reason in light of an entailment, you are somehow sensitive, or you take, or whatever you do with the entailment, and then you find yourself with these ascent levels, and there are several possible patterns of coherent ascent levels, and your reasoning is going to enforce one. Which one? That's going to be determined by radicality, by the degree of radicality. And the idea is a very simple-minded idea. So if S reasons in light of the fact that A entails B, and starts with ascent levels to B that is smaller than the ascent level to A, then S should. Now there's this case distinction. Raise ascent to B if her ascent to A is rationally more radical than ascent to B. And she should lower ascent to A if her ascent to B is rationally more radical than ascent to A. And she should realize that she's in a pickle if the ascent to A and B are equally radical. Does that make sense?
Can you say again what radicality is?
So this is a functional description of what a radicality is. So radicality is going to be what that is. Radicality is, it's something, we'll talk about that later, but it's something close to, not close, I think it's really different, but I think it's what people are sometimes after when they talk about entrenchment, or when they talk about weight of evidence. Or sometimes people like to cash it out in terms of resilience of credences, things like that. So there is a bunch of different notions there, and radicality is. So basically, the idea is you have ascent to A, you have ascent to B. Your ascent to B is lower than your ascent to A, but now you realize that A entails B. So it's clear that the only way to be coherent is one in which you ascend at least as much to B as you ascend to A. And of course you can do that in two different ways. You can raise ascent to B, or you can lower ascent to A. And one is the modus ponency thing, and the other is the modus tolency thing. Or you can realize that you have a problem, and then better do something about the problem. But I'm not going to tell you what you're going to do about the problem. You have a problem. That's as much as I'm going to tell you. Okay. So here are two features of radicality as I understand it. So all of this is trying to explain what radicality is, right? So your question, I'm trying to answer this question. I'm not sure how far I will get. You know, we'll see how far I can get with that. So the first property that I think radicality has is that the ascent to A is strictly more radical than ascent to B if the ascent to A is based on ascent to B is based on the ascent to A. So the basis is strictly more radical than the base C in the rational case. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. I'm only talking about the rational case without closure, because if you have closure, of course, none of this is happening. But rationality without closure is where we're starting, because then we have to figure out irrational agents later on. Okay, so the idea here is, if you have a basis, that basis must be somehow more. You have to. You know, the idea why I call it radicality is, of course, the Latin radix. It's root, right? So the basis is closer to the root than whatever springs from the basis. It's like a plant. You know, the tree is further away from the root than the stem of the. The leaf of the tree is further away from the root than the stem of the tree. So the stem of the tree is the basis, and the leaf is what's based on the tree. So the stem is more radical, right? It's closer to the root. So that's the idea of radicality. That's feature number one. And feature number two is, if S's ascent to A is more radical than S's ascent to B, then would it come to light that A and B are incompatible? Then ceteris paribus, S would give up B rather than A. So if you have to chop down the tree, you do it as it were in a minimal way, right? If the law enforces you to chop down parts of your tree, you don't immediately go for the stem. You try to go for the leaves first. Then the less radical stuff has to go first. Okay. So I think these two features are not independent. I think these features are really just one thing at the end of the day. But because I want to have something to say, I make two out of them. And I hope that that's somehow illuminating. Here's how I think that they're related. I think that one is basically the more radical one. And then two follows from that. So one supports two. If ascent to A is more radical than to B, and A and B are incompatible, then ascent to A can be the basis on which you reject B, right? So A is more radically, you ascend more radically to A than to B, and it comes to light that they are incompatible, then you might think, well, I really have to give up B. I have to lower ascent to B. Why? Well, because A. So you reduce ascent to A on the ascent to B on the basis of A, and that's really what's happening in case number two, I think. Now, I'm not exactly sure. I will try to argue a little bit for one, but there is a point where I will just have to dig in my heels and say, that just seems how things are to me. That seems really plausible, you know, and this will come to an end at some point. But I think there is some intuitive sense in which, well, if something is a reason for which you believe it, somehow the reason must have a good epistemic status that can then be transferred to whatever it is that you base on that reason, right? You have to start with the reason. That has to be good, and then whatever you reason to from that, that should also be good, partly in virtue of the reason that you have for that thing being good. So there should be something good to start with your reason, and that's, I think that it's plausible. So the strictly here, of course, assumes that that the goodness cannot be imparted fully, that there's always a little bit of loss, as it were. We can talk about whether the strictly more is really warranted, but the idea is you cannot impart more than you have. So the reason cannot give more to what it is a reason for than it has, and that's why it has to have more of it. Okay, it's because I couldn't figure out a good deductive argument for my view. I will just point to history and say, smart people before me have thought something like that, so believe me. I know that that's not a good argument, but I will try it out, and then we maybe, at least we could get to read quotes from dead people. That's fun for me. Here's what Plato said in the Meno. For true opinions escape from a man's mind so that they are not worth much until one ties them down by giving an account of the reason why. After they are tied down in the first place, they become knowledge, and then they remain in place. And I think, on my way of thinking, what Plato was after was the notion, something like radicality here, because what Plato thought was, look, if you can have a true belief, but knowledge is better. And why is knowledge better than true belief? Well, if you have knowledge, it's tied down. It's not, he compares the merely true belief to a runaway slave, right? But like, knowledge is not like a runaway slave. It's tied down. It doesn't run away. And what's doing the tying down? That you can use it then to do other useful work for you. Sorry, I mean, it's Plato, right? You realize. I realize that all of this is politically inappropriate, but I hope you all. Well, and I'm thinking, well, the radicality ties it down, right? Radicality, as it were, is the kind of thing that makes it stable. Because the more radical something is, the more stable it is, the more it's harder to knock it off. Similarly, I think Descartes, if you read the Meditations again, so he starts out with looking for this unshakable foundation for things, and he wants to replace the shaky foundations for his opinions with certain knowledge on which he can base the rest of his beliefs. Right? He wants to build up the edifice on the basis of certain knowledge. But that kind of certainty, if that has to be in the basis, I think that is really radicality. I don't think that's Ascent level. Really. He wants to have something on which he can base other things. He wants to have the kind of thing that tells you from here you can go on, and you won't have to do a modus tollens, right? From here you can just do modus ponens upwards. You can start here and reason forward with no necessity to go back. But that's radicality, that's not Ascent level. Yeah. I think you also find an idea like that in Wittgenstein. There it's actually pretty explicit, so that's why I like the Wittgenstein quote. Wittgenstein starts uncertainty by saying, when one says that such and such a proposition can't be proved, of course that doesn't mean that it can't be derived from other propositions. Any proposition can be derived from other propositions, but they may be no more certain than it is itself. That strikes me as obviously correct. Yes, every proposition can be derived from some proposition. That's obviously true. That can't be what is meant when people say something can't be proved. Something else. So there must be some other condition. What's the condition? In my view, the condition is that it must be more certain. And that more certain can again not be Ascent level. Later on he says, my having two hands is in normal circumstances as certain as anything I could produce in evidence for it. That is why I'm not in a position to take the sight of my hands as evidence for it. So in order to take something to be evidence, you have to be more certain of that thing. The basis has to be more certain than what's based on it. Again, radicality. You can get an argument out of this. If you say, well, basis must be more certain than what is based on it. That seems to be what Wittgenstein is saying, right? The basis must be more certain than what's based on it. Reasoning established basing relations. So it seems that the premises of reasoning must be more certain than the conclusion of reasoning. But that flies in the face of what we said about ascent levels, right? So that is basically just the radicality intuition underwritten there. Or, I don't know, underwritten, something. That was feature number 1, if you think back about the features of radicality. Feature number 2 is also well attested in the literature. I think it's most clearly comes out in Moore. Moore says, the attempt to prove by means of such a principle as Hume's, Hume has a principle about knowledge and leads to a skeptical conclusion. I'm not going to, we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. That we cannot know the existence of any material object seems to me to be a characteristic instance of the sort of argument with which is very common in philosophy, namely an attempt to prove that a given proposition is false by means of a principle which is in fact much less certain than the proposition which is supposed to be proven false by its means. And I think what he says there can be formulated as follows. You want to give an argument. You want to give an argument from some principle, so that's Hume's principle, to not A, something that there are no material objects or something like that. And that has force only if the principle is less certain than the certainty of A. That's what Moore says. And he thinks it's a mistake if that doesn't hold, right? That's the mistake of the philosopher. The strictly less, that comes from me. And property 2 was that of two incompatible claims, you should give up the less radical one, right? The less certain one. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because makes sense of what he says, because if you start out with A and this principle is less certain, then according to the second property, you should give up the principle and you should not give up A. And so you should not come to believe not A on that basis. So really, I think this is just more endorsing the second feature of radicality that I pointed to. You can also connect that to property 1. I don't want to go into that. Now, is ascent level and radicality, are they really different? I've been claiming that they're different, but are they really different? I want to give you a couple of considerations why they really are different. So what I call dominance is that you should ascend at least as much towards the conclusion of an entailment as you ascend towards the premise. And I think that just doesn't hold for radicality. It's false that if A entails B, then rationality requires that one ascends to to B at least as radically as one ascends to A. The argument goes something like this. Deductive reasoning can establish basing relations. Rational basing relations require strictly more radical bases, so dominance fails. So this kind of dominance equivalence for radicality. And that's not just the temporal. You might think you get over this by saying, well, radicality and ascent levels change in the course of reasoning. But this has nothing temporal about it because it's talking about the basing relations that come out of that at the end of reasoning, right? This is not just something that changes over the course of reasoning. That's something that you might object to that, well, isn't basing compatible with equal radicality? And I say no, because there's a strict epistemic priority relation. I won't go into this. I also think that you find the same, you can bring out radicality also with inconsistent triads or inconsistent n-tuples of claims. Basically, there the idea is you have to give, if you find yourself with an inconsistent triad, you always have to give up the least radical one. But that need not be the one with the least ascent level. So this is the problem of evil, and there is an almighty and benevolent God. The actual world is not the best of all possible worlds. An almighty and benevolent God would assure that the actual world is the best of all possible worlds. Those three are inconsistent. One has to go. I assume that you find all three initially plausible. Which one has to go? And I'm thinking it's not clear to me that it's irrational, for example, to start out with a very radical but middling ascent level to 1. Because you think, I should neither strongly assent to nor strongly deny that there is an almighty and benevolent God. Maybe that's something that I leave to the theologians, or maybe I would think, well, you have to look and see what happens when you die, or something like that, And then I also might think, well, I might ascend very highly to 2, maybe because, as Ivan in the Brother Karamazov points out, innocent children suffer, so the world is a shitty place, really. That seems like, that's almost certain that the world is a shitty place. There's not really in doubt. I might think, well, 3 looks really plausible. 3 just looks immensely like something that you should believe, but that might not be belief, so high ascent level, but you might have very little radicality, because once you think about it, you might think, well, really, a counterfactual about necessary beings. How do we evaluate counterfactuals about necessary beings? They're supposed to be in every possible world and all that. It's really tricky. So you might think, yeah, it looks very plausible. I want to assent a lot to that, but it's very flexible, right? It's easy to change that. And in that kind of case, I think it might be rational to give up 3 here, or to lower ascent to 3 because of the middling ascent level to 1, right? So the middling ascent level, the middling credence is driving the adjustment of the high credence here, if you want to have credence terms. It's not high credence that determines which one is the strong one. It's something else. The one with the low credence or the middling credence can be the strong one in these kind of combinations. All right. Also, I think I'm going to skip that. Just one short note. Credences or ascent levels are symmetric around the middle point with negation, right? If you negate, you flip the whole thing basically up and down. That doesn't work with radicality. If you ascend radically to A, you typically also ascend with the mirroring degree equally radically or almost equally radically to the negation of A. So there's no symmetry under negation of these things. They work very differently. Okay, so is this real? Is the confusion real? If I have convinced you that there are these 2 things, you might think, no one would ever run them together. They're so different, No one is so stupid. Maybe Ulf, you are so stupid that you confuse these things, but no one else other than you has ever confused these 2 things. So I want to say it's not only me who's so stupid. There are other people that, they're not stupid, but other people who have fallen for the same kind of... Could anyone really confuse the ones? So the first... Sorry?
It's a good group.
Well, the first thing is what do you have people who like credences, have they ever confused them? And the first thing I thought, well, have these people confused these things? And then I looked, what are credences? And one thing is, it's so tricky to know what credences are. And I had a hard time figuring out what credences are. And people have all these different accounts of credences. On any of them, it doesn't seem that likely that you might confuse them. But I still think it happens. So here's one case in which it happens. Job has this criticism of Pritchard. And he says, well, Pritchard is committed to the following. Proposition P is rationally grounded only if the rational grounds are more certain than the proposition itself. And then Job goes after Pritchard in this whole paper saying that is inconsistent with dominance for credences. That is the main criticism of that paper. That's the centerpiece of this paper. I'm thinking, it's just obvious to me that what Pritchard has in mind is not credence. It's this is stuff that I would call radicality. And once you see the distinction, it seems like patently obvious to me that that's what he has to mean. But Job really dismisses this without any reason. He says, the only other alternative is to radically disconnect the notions of degrees of confidence and degrees of certainty in such a way that what Pritchard means by belief being grounded in a particular degree of certainty is not to be understood in terms of high credence or confidence or particular credence. I do not think this alternative has much going for it. That's where it ends. He doesn't give a reason why this alternative hasn't much going for it. And I'm thinking, you better give me a damn good reason for that, because it seems to me charity basically requires you to do that. Here's another example where yes.
You're not, okay.
I know, I just want to finish up. It's going to be quick. There is a view popular, when you think if you want to have a view on which credences come first and then qualitative beliefs come later, well, of course, what do you do? And one view in the literature is that if your credence is high enough to treat it as a reason, then it's a belief. Some people, so for example, McGrath formulates the view as follows: you believe P if and only if you have a credence in P high enough so that you are disposed to use P as a reason for further beliefs or actions. And I just think, well, whether or not you're disposed to use something as a belief, as a ground for action or belief, is a matter of radicality. It's not a matter of confidence, it's not a matter of ascent level, it's not a matter of credence. So it's just it's a non-starter. Once you make the distinction between radicality and ascent level, this view doesn't get off the ground. It just seems to me to be pure confusion. So I don't, You might think that AGM or belief revision or Spohn ranking theory have made the right distinction because they talk about entrenchment. I think they don't, and I have some arguments, but I won't give them to you. So here's the summary. There are two kinds of degrees of certainty, they play importantly different roles. What are these roles? Ascent levels are governed by these coherent norms, and they at least partly derive from entailments. As you get entailments, and that defines coherent patterns of ascent levels. Radicality is something like fitness to play the role of a reason or a basis, and that's something very different, and so we have to distinguish these two things. And the confusion is real. People have run these things together, and that's why important to distinguish them. And we might have a good theory of ascent levels with Bayesianism. I don't accept that, but you might think that. But I don't think we have a good theory of radicality. So really, I think we need a theory of radicality and that's the message. Yeah.